welcome back to another episode of the Process and Automation podcast. Today, we will look at process mapping, and we will go through 6 methods how you can actually look at your processes and map them out. And generally, there are 2 really distinct aspects to process mapping. One is using process mapping software tools to create a process map. And provided that you pick the right software, this is probably for most the easiest one. And the other part is capturing the content of these processes manually. So, and we dive into these methods now one by one. Arno, what 6 methods do we have for our listeners today?
Yes, thanks, Sasha. So, as we discussed in our Clubhouse session earlier, mapping out of processes is really key part to successful automation projects. And, from the actual ideation to actual mapping the process out to the automation, you want to have real clarity when you map your processes out. So we decided today to really touch on 6 main methods to create these process maps, which is, obviously a combination of perhaps your workflow process, or it could be, RPA processes that's contained within inside the workflow maps itself. And generally, there are roughly 6 methods for creating these process maps. And, one of them is obviously through individual staff or small group interviews, where it's sort of a workshop setting. Now, these days, this can be done online a lot, and there's several tools that you can use, whiteboarding tool, digital whiteboarding tools, but it's really just kind of getting a group of people together and talk about the process and really, the main aim here is to really talk about the process, map it out step by step, and really get inputs from everybody that is involved in the process. And again, this is by using a technique that's called group interviews. The second method is through facilitated discovery workshop. So facilitated discovery workshops is more kind of structured, where you have the workshops. It's more agenda driven, and it's got the same aim as well as the group interviews. But again, with that, you go in with a specific agenda on a specific topic that you want to cover, and hopefully the output of that would be that we've got a process map that represents the process we want to automate. The third method is really to analyze existing documentation. So a lot of our customers, they map out their processes themselves, or to a degree they do so, and what we tend to then do is really look at that documentation and do a process analysis on that. Now, this could be in various formats that receive the documents. So really, our job is really to take that and really translate it into a process map that we can then, put in an automation tool. The fourth method is by direct works of observations, and it's really what we call time and motion studies, where you physically try and understand what people do day to day. So that's a very popular technique as well. There are tools to help you with that, like task capture tools that you could put recorders on people's desktops to understand, what they do day to day. And then the fifth method we have is through business analysis design. So basically, you go to work at a business problem. You use some business analysis techniques to understand the process and what the process should do, and really based on those findings, you map out the to-be process. And when you do that, you kind of look at what this process, by analyzing the business, what this process currently is, and how can we improve this process? How can we map this out by deploying some optimization techniques to make the process as good as possible? And then of course we can also import existing process documentation. So if there's somebody in the organization that has used the BPMN, which is business process modeling notation maps, that's something you can easily import into a process mapping tool, and you can go to work on that. So there's a broad set of techniques that you can use, and I think it's really finding the right technique for particular scenario or for the particular customer perhaps that you deal with. And it also, the approach you choose will depend heavily on the size of the organization, the team culture, the available resources, and good personal preference. Some people might like it if you do discovery workshop. And I think the key here is the fact that you can choose one of the methods, or you can choose a combination of these sort of 6 methods that I've mentioned earlier, to obtain that required degree of accuracy when you map out your processes. Again, each of these different methods has got its own strengths and weaknesses as well. Where one method works in one organization, it might not work in another organization. So it's really important to really understand, I guess, the audience, understand the unique sort of circumstances of the actual job at hand. When you go into a process mapping session, and really to try and pick the right method, for your needs. If you have perhaps an organization where the resources are not readily available, people might be quite busy, then you might have to resort to a business analysis at the design approach, where you might have to discover yourself how the process work, and by using people's time in short bursts, if you know what I mean, and go around different people and not necessarily get them in the same room, but talk to different people and sort of start to assemble.
And sometimes you can break down a bigger process, a bigger problem into lots of smaller ones, and then maybe it's a bit more digestible or manageable within the business.
Yes.
Yeah, so that brings me actually to the first point you mentioned, the method. So maybe we should drill a bit deeper into that one by one. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. And so maybe the first one, you mentioned was staff and small group interviews. This indeed, from my experience, for most of our customers, and when we look at departments, is the most popular form of process mapping as a technique. So sitting down in this small groups, and get a whiteboard or lots of whiteboards, clipboards, that kind of stuff. Lots of good pens, and then discuss in this small group. Basically bring everyone who's involved in that process. When you think about purchase to pay process, very straightforward process, or client onboarding process. So if you have that, you will bring everyone into the room, or these days into a virtual session. You mentioned you using Miro as well, Arno, on our Clubhouse session. And so that works really well. You can map out very straightforward the process, how it should run, define sort of all the scenarios and all the little details. So, and if there's a business analyst available in this little group, in this small group, sometimes someone is just taking over that role. But if you have the luxury of a business analyst, so you will just gather the information, put it structured onto the whiteboards, into Miro. So that person who is sort of leading that session is required to ask really direct questions to every delegate workshop. Yeah, and then you can fill in all the details. You map out all the activities in your process, all the deliverables, all the assets, everything what's part of the process, and then you get to the full picture how a process should be put together going forward. And yeah, so there's some pro tips we have as well. When you have a session like this, have really a prepared set of topics and you want to cover, and a really good set of specific questions, and don't overdo it, because everyone in this room is quite focused on this process, but a 1 hour session is certainly enough to get through a lot of stuff. 2 hours at some point, your brain is working, you can't work efficiently anymore. So if you have a really focused session, 1 hour per session is enough. And and if a discussion doesn't go anywhere, so the discussion is getting blocked, park the problem and come back to this problem on another session, because maybe at the end of a session everyone is so focused in depth on a specific topic. You will not get to a solution. And be quite strict. Never overrun. You said 1 hour, so you're doing 1 hour, and then people are more open to the next session which is coming up, because no one hates if it overruns like 4 hours and suddenly or you can't handle all the other work you have to do. So that's how we do most of our sessions. Sometimes it goes into bigger ones and bigger workshops. So Arno, you had a plan a couple of them, isn't it?
Yes, quite recently. And the technique we use there is really facilitated discovery workshops. And we use this technique where it's important to gain consensus from a larger group of people, and it's really appropriate for these type of sessions to be at a higher level of abstraction, as opposed to sort of detailed levels that the group interviews is conducted in. And again, with these workshops, the discovery type workshops can be more productive over a longer period of time. So sometimes you would need several of these to get through the process or the high level processes. So really the trick is to retain energy and interest in the room, and you also need a very skilled and experienced facilitator that could facilitate the session, and also make sure that there are engagement from the participants. So there's a couple of tips when you do these facilitated discovery workshops. And again, it is the job of the participants to define the process and to make the workshop successful, not the facilitators. So the facilitator really need to ensure that this, he or she involves the people in the process discussion, keep as much energy, variation and interest in the workshops as possible, keep to the time frames, make sure that we don't overrun, and also make sure the participants are comfortable, make sure that the facilities are really comfortable, and stick with your facilitation process, and don't engage in sort of peripheral subject matter debates. Leave that to the participants. I think that the thing that you want to do is you want to ensure that you kind of stay neutral. You want people to start talking amongst each other, really. And of course, like you said, you need to have frequent breaks. So if you do have long sessions, you might have a whole day scheduled for this. Don't sit people 6 hours in the room. Make sure you kind of give people time to have breaks. They will then kind of be able to reflect on what they've just discussed. So all of these are really, really, really good tips to make sure that the session is quite fluid and you make progress. With these things, you could easily, if you're a facilitator, like some of the workshops we had recently, you can easily gauge the participation and gauge the interest of people, because naturally sometimes there will be a bit of a quiet period where people don't participate. So I think it's really your job as a facilitator to spark up the interest again. Maybe take a break, come back, go over a process segment that you've just covered, and start with a new section. Right?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So the first two sessions or methods are sessions with people. But there could be also, like you mentioned earlier, a bit easier approach. The analysis of existing documentation is maybe not as obvious to many. But yeah, it is. I would say an underused technique. But when you ask people within the business, how does the process run already, maybe they point you to this existing documentation. Sometimes that documentation is very old, but still it can give you a lot of insight into the process, how it's generally running. In most organizations we come across as well, it is very outdated. That documentation and inaccurate. Sometimes it's absolutely useless indeed. But if you come across a document which is more up to date, it could be a big time saver. If you can actually derive the whole process from that documentation alone. Or maybe in combination, a bit of a documentation and then a really small session, a small group session, maybe fills in the gaps and brings it really up to date. But if you have a more established environment where you already have a couple of processes, so this technique could be very useful. You could take that documentation and then start mapping that process from that documentation. Sometimes you already have that ready to go process documentation within these documents you can use. So I guess a tip, if you have access to this existing documentation, you have to really go through this in depth and this is a job for somebody who can hunker down and grind through this to these documents until the job is done. So you really have to turn go through everything here, get all the document sources together at the beginning, and keep that as a defined scope. So it's very discouraging to manage if the documentation pool is allowed to grow mid-analysis, and so it's like a moving target. Yes. Much better to complete the job with the first set of documentation, and then repeat the whole process again if new sources you come across new sources. I think that's sometimes is the problem, especially in large organizations. Suddenly another department comes with a different variation of that process. So we have a couple of those customers, big finance institutes, lots of old documentation and plenty of places where documentation is stored. So that could be a bit of a bummer, but
I think you, by the trained eye, it's easy to discount documents that's perhaps not relevant or discount documents that's out of date. I think if you have got a trained eye and you look at process documentation and you know what you look for, it can sometimes be, quite easy to understand, how do I actually extract the actual process that we need to go and automate from this, and how do I sort of ignore some of the noise? Now, it takes a bit of experience to get to that level, but I think the more you do it, the easier it gets. And that sort of brings us to the fourth technique to to do process mapping is really direct work observation. And this particular method is usually more efficient in a highly manual business environment, where process steps can be overseen and you can observe the tasks in real time. And of course, you need to have permission to do that. We call this a time and motion study, but that's a very, very tried and trusted method. Again, you need to prepare for this. You need to make sure that people understand that your particular process mapping exercise will involve direct work observation. Ask the right questions. Ask people why they do specific things, and I think you will soon realize how the process flow. And if I just jump into the fifth method, and that's our business analysis and design, and this is the one that I mentioned earlier, where you don't particularly have access to stakeholders, or the process you're trying to map doesn't really exist. So it's one of those where you don't really have access to those subject matter expertise, because it's either too impractical. You can't just drag the CFO into a process discovery workshop for 5 hours, or it's very expensive to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite typical in sort of clinical and academic environments where it is really hard to get those experts in a room. So I think this is where the sort of business analyst element comes into play, where your direct knowledge of the process or the process to be is important, and it will require you to use a variety of methods to get to that point where you could propose a proposal for a process that would work. And it shouldn't be a guesstimate. It should be something that you've analyzed, you've calculated it. And of course, that's something that you could put together, and you need to present it back to the business. So and again, with this technique, it's not so invasive, because you're not really asking too much of people's time, but it can take a bit longer, because behind the scenes you do the business analysis, and then from there on, you need to create a process map. So there's a couple of tips there as well for our listeners if you do this approach. And the first one is really not to make any assumptions. It's very easy to dive into this sort of business analysis or process analysis and make a lot of assumptions. And once you've got your process map, when you review it with the stakeholders, it's full of holes. So that's very important, that you really understand the things you work with is factual. You've got evidence to back that up. And again, that's part of sort of the analysis that you will do with insight that the problem you're trying to solve. The second tip is really that you need to gain strong approval, from people once the process is mapped. And if you don't have the subject matter, the business subject matters expertise involved with inside the mapping, what you need to be able to do is involve them in the sign-off of it. So you need to have very practical ways and easy ways to explain to them what your idea is to solve this problem, and the benefits it will bring in automating this type of process. These people might be quite busy, so you need to deploy really strong techniques to really use their time, their time quite efficiently. So keep your presentation of what you think the process should be like and how to solve the problem really to the point. And again, when you deploy the sort of business analysis design technique, what you need to do is you need to time box yourself and not get too carried away. You need to look at a process and perhaps create, I don't know, a couple of pages of it, map it out, and once you're done with that, optimize it, make sure it's as best as it could be, and try to get that sign off from the process stakeholders, so you could move forward, right? So I think that the whole idea here is that it is a bit of self-discovery. You need to have creativity in mind as well, because sometimes you're not going to have all of the answers. But I think that also provides an opportunity to create something quite new that's perhaps not just automating an existing manual process, but it's coming up with a really new idea that could make the process a lot better.
Mm. Yeah, so that brings us to the last method and the last technique. Maybe on this good position, you can import and use existing process documentation. So that's, I guess, in the perfect world, what you will have. The perfect world, we would import process documentation from existing sources, and these days we probably would look at these sources in three different types. So one would be unstructured sources of process documentation, some documents, we covered that earlier, maybe some slides from previous workshops, some videos, spreadsheets, all sorts of stuff we could use to document our process and import that stuff into our process mapping tools. And so what unstructured is quite difficult, as we know. So we need some really good understanding of what's really part of it, probably very manual to start with. And otherwise they are structured, where we already have process maps and flowcharts available. And the third type we talk about is interchangeable content sources. So this could be models, UML, BPMN, and different other types. So when we look at the unstructured part, so there's a lot of stuff happening at the moment. So we as well have the Convedo Intelligent Capture Cloud to make meaning out of unstructured information. So if we want to really import that information, we need some help, I guess, with AI to extract that meaning. Otherwise, if we have unstructured content, it goes back to the analysis of existing documentation, which is a very manual approach and tedious approach. But there in these documents and spreadsheets and all that stuff, we find a lot of information potentially. And we wouldn't need so much BA time. We wouldn't need so much workshop time. So it's definitely interesting to look at this, and hopefully in the future we can get even more out of unstructured information sort of automatically. But when we look at structured sources, so that's information we can import in sort of an original format. That could be maybe a Visio diagram, or could be another one, BPMN diagram from another tool. So that's very structured, and that's absolutely ideal if we have that, so we can import that straight away. And then there are other interchangeable formats. You might have come across already, BPML or XPDL. So these formats, there are some tools out there which are writing these formats out sort of in a standard and compliant way, to define a real process. And if you have a system out there who can import it, you have all the definition, everything in place straight away.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally that's the ideal place you want to be. But I think, from a practical sense, just looking back at, the years worth of process mapping we've done, I think, interview style kind of group sessions work pretty well. I think that the key is to have the right people in the room, representatives and stakeholders of the actual people that participate in the process, perhaps the process owner or owners. Clearly defined roles and responsibilities of, how work flow between the different people that participate. Clearly defined sort of metrics on how long it should take for work to flow. So these are things that's quite subtle, but it's a good facilitator would be able to table these questions and really challenge the people around the room to provide their input. And really, I think the ultimate goal is really, as people speak, is to solve these problems, and to have the debates on, should it go to this department or should it go to that team member? What happens if somebody's out of office? Should we send a notification because we get so many notifications anyway, or should we send a daily summary of notifications to people to alert them that they're on the task? What happens in exceptions? How do we deal with any exceptions, for example? Where can we plug RPA robot in, for example? What type of reporting do we need to have for our process that's in flight? That's very important to talk about. When we interact with our processes, what type of user interfaces do we require? If we design dashboards with SLA indicators, how that need to look like?
Yeah.
So there's so many talking points that you can bring into these sessions, and I think the key is to get the participants to engage. I'm a firm believer that people tend to only talk about stuff that's important, and this is really important because people tend to, when they have a discussion, especially in process mapping exercises, the things that's really relevant to them in terms of automation is the stuff they talk about, and everything else is really what we could consider to be out of scope. So it's really, really quite a focused thing. And hopefully, if you conduct these sessions in the right way and you ask the right questions, you can walk away with a well-defined process map that's ready for automation, that hasn't got too many areas of outstanding discussion points, and that's ready to pass to automation developers to configure with inside the automation tool.
Yeah, one thing we came across as well, sometimes when this is why it's so important to get really the right people and everyone of that process, part of this process in the room, because sometimes if you have a good energetic group and discussing one person is missing, they definitely talk about the stuff they think it's important, but then suddenly someone else comes along and looks at the output of that workshop, say, but what about this and what about that? So we have this department here, and what about this? Suddenly, the whole thing falls apart, isn't it? So as you mentioned that earlier in the Clubhouse session, and that's very important.
Yes.
To look at potentially, if you don't have the right access, if you have already some other information which can help in a workshop, that would be good. Otherwise, there's always a bit of a risk.
And I think
miss out an important point.
And I think that assuming that the right people are in the room and you host the sessions in such a way that you make really good, meaningful progress, I think you energize people, and if your technique is refined and you do it the right way, people will more likely return to these sessions and contribute more. And I think it's easy to gauge their interest, because if your sessions are boring, they're long-winded, you don't get problems resolved, and people tend to have this kind of mindset of, well, this is pointless, we never getting anywhere, it's too hard, we can't do this, there's too many people in the room, can't we just write a document and give that to you? But of course, the danger with that is that people write in different styles, people put too much details in a document, it's very hard to extract the MVP or minimal viable process from the documentation. So your technique really needs to be quite good. So there's meaningful flow. There is solutions to problems. If there's blockers or points people get stuck in, this is where experience is quite good, where you can perhaps on the fly suggest alternative ways of doing it. Perhaps you've got some experience of a similar process you've done for another customer that could help. So all of these things really help to make the sessions quite dynamic, quite enjoyable. And we find that at the end of these sessions, once you have mapped the process out and people can see it, there is a sense of pride that people feel, well, I've actually participated in this. We have actually nailed this. We've got the process mapped out. We are quite pleased, with what we've achieved today. And that's a good start to any project, because once you get to that point and you've already got that sort of early success in just doing something small but important, like process mapping, the rest, it's a good start for a successful project delivery then.
Absolutely, it's key. It's without that, how would you know in what direction you have to go, isn't it? So it's absolutely important to get that part right. I think that's it for today. Our 6 methods how you can create your process maps. So if you are keen to learn more about creating your process maps, or you need more help with this one, Arno and I are here for you, and reach out to us via the social channels or visit our website, theautomationguys.net. And so we can help you to get started with your automation initiatives. And thank you very much for listening. See you all soon. Let's automate it. Unfortunately, that's it again with this episode of the Process in Automation podcast. If you liked this episode, please give us a 5-star rating, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any upcoming episode. We hope you will tune in next time, and until then, let's automate it.